So one of the things that we talk about when we talk about water resources, a specific type of geology, is one where we have caves or what we call karst topography. Karst, we think of like Mammoth Cave, we think of Florida, we think of, underground rivers. In those areas. The state of Illinois has a lot of karst or cave systems. It's around the edges. So you can see in this map where there is green is where there's karst. I also put a link, I'll show that in just a second here, to a website that goes into karst landscapes in Illinois. So please read through this as part of this assignment. It goes into how is karst formed and where is it in the state of Illinois. Well, one of the dramatic things that happens when we have karst is things like this. So this is a Florida home collapsing into a sinkhole. So here's the sinkhole. It's a cave system. The geology, and I'll explain how this happens in a second, but it's this very dramatic kind of thing. Look at all of that going right into the hole. You might have seen car dealerships fall into the ground and all that. Those are the same types of things. Well, what happens when we have those type of dramatic situations is we have the cave systems here. The groundwater is washing away or dissolving the limestone. So what's limestone? Well, if we remember back at the beginning of class, we talked about limestone, calcium carbonate. It's formed a couple different ways, but if we think of it as coral reefs or beaches, if we talked about like Stony Island and the Thornton Quarry, if you're driving on I-94 heading into Indiana, that is all limestone right in there. Well, limestone will get dissolved as water is flowing through it. There'll be cracks into it, what we call fractures. The water flows through it, it slowly dissolves it, and as it dissolves it, it creates caverns inside of it, and then those caverns can collapse. And so we'll get cave systems. So if you go to Hannibal, Missouri, if you read Mark Twain, you could go visit his cave system there. There's a lot of karst across the entire United States. And so we'll get these holes or these sinkholes forming, which are around circular depressions. I talked about them also. We call them cenotes down in Mexico. Same thing, a large carbonate platform collapsing down. And so it's very easy for the groundwater to get contaminated. So when we have these systems, this is the drinking water supply right here for a lot of people. In certain parts of the country, they'll talk about the illness of the family. Well, because they put their septic system and their drinking water well right next to each other. So a septic system is a way of dealing with waste. It gets into their drinking water supply, and they're constantly just infecting themselves in there. You're going to have hog waste. Whatever you've got nearby, it can get into the system very easily. And so when you have karst, you have got to be very careful about what you're doing for water quality and water quantity in those areas. So we call it caves. So we'll get those sinkholes. I showed you that video of that major collapse that happens. This is a problem of Kentucky, so that's where Mammoth Cave is, Tennessee, Missouri, that's Mark Twain, Florida. If you go to Florida, you go to Mexico, I mentioned Cancun area. We walk around on the ground there sometimes, and we can just hit the ground and we can feel the holes below it. It's kind of scary. And so it makes these circular depressions that happen into there. And a lot of times when people put their well in, they'll have it go right down to this drinking water supply where they only have so much soil or rock that's above it. And so very easy to contaminate it. As I said before, we call it karst. That is just the term, the geologic term that we use for the system. We call it karst and karst topography, karst areas inside of there. And it's sinkholes, so we can get all these little sinkholes and depressions that you have inside of there. You'll see them. One of my friends was doing a study, and one of the ways that we can figure out which way the groundwater is flowing in karst, because karst, these cave systems that you see here, they may not be connected to each other, so you could put a groundwater well here and then over here. These things are not even connected to each other, but they could be feet apart from each other. And you might drop something here and it comes out over here, and you would think that it came out over here. So sometimes it's very complicated to figure out which way groundwater is flowing in these systems, because it's almost chaotic, how these systems work. So they were doing what was called a dye tracer test. You dump in, you know how we turn the Chicago River green Yeah, during St. Patrick's Day. Well, not this year, but normally we turn the river green. Well, that's called fluorescein dye. Well, we can dump fluorescein dye into an area and then see where it comes out, and then we can say, oh, there it is. That's where the groundwater is flowing. It flows from this point to this point. Well, they were doing one down in Florida and they couldn't find it. Like they had done some preliminary work and said, oh, it's going to come out over here. Well, there was a cheese manufacturer that was pumping water at that particular time. It changed the groundwater flow, and all of a sudden all their cheese turned fluorescent green. So that was an interesting one. So this can happen not just with limestone. I mentioned limestone already. It can happen with gypsum. Do you remember what gypsum was? If not, make sure you look that up. Halite. You guys remember what halite was? If not, look it up. And these can dissolve away. So if you've ever gone to Mammoth Cave down in Kentucky, you go to Florida. One of the books that you might be interested in reading is called Mirage. It's all about Florida water issues, and basically by the end of it you'll know why you hate Disney. But so it talks about Florida water issues, and so it's a really good book if you're really interested in Florida. So water uses in the United States can be different. So we do have an ample water supply. The problem is distribution and with climate change. So as we're having climate change, we're going to be changing where the water is. We're going to have areas that are wetter, drier, longer times of flooding, less droughts, more drought. So as things are changing, and that's part of what climate change is that it changes. Right now we do have a lot of water. We get a lot of water in where we are, but you've got areas like Texas and stuff that don't have enough water. And so they look at our Great Lakes and they're like, ooh, let's put a giant straw in here and like suck this water out and take it to areas where there's a lot more people, i.e. the Southwest. Well, the problem is there's groundwater divides with things that we were talking about. We have international treaties with Canada, so we can't deplete these lakes. Thank God, Canada's on our side here. But people look at our massive amounts of water and say, well, can't we have it where the people are living? Well, one of the things that I've been working on is, can we move more businesses to the state of Illinois because we actually have water? When we talk about Lagunitas, if you know Lagunitas Brewing, they actually relocated or have another brewery here in the state of Illinois because we have water. So when we're thinking at economics, we're looking at food, we're looking at a lot of different things. This is the combination of these things. These things come together. We can't talk about food without water. These things are work together, and where the people are. So this is one of the issues. When we look around the world, there's a lot of water resources that certain parts of the world are dying and have very low water usage, or have very high demands of water, very low water. And so they're using almost all of their water resources in those areas. So when we look at groundwater pumping, this is from 1990, but it still shows today. These high areas are where we're pumping lots and lots of groundwater. Well, we're pumping lots and lots of groundwater here in Chicago, and I showed you those maps that shows where the distributions are of the cities, and we're one of the biggest groundwater drawers in the area. So is the San Joaquin Valley, as we've already talked about. And when we look at groundwater withdrawals, we have a large part in the central part of the United States. Well, this part in the United States is where we get a lot of our food too. This is the Arkansas, the Nebraskas of the world, where we start getting into some of these aquifers and these issues. And so we do what is called central point pivot irrigation, where we put a well in the center and you make these big circles so the water comes out and it does everything in a circle, because they don't get enough rainwater. And so they look at groundwater as a bank of water. Well, if we're actually mining water, because it's the recharge is not as much as we're taking out, and we're not putting that water back in. And so we're actually mining our water, not allowing it to be inside of this cycle and balance system. And so we need to be making sure we take care of our groundwater. Well, the last thing I want to talk about is the hidden water that's in our food, because this is just always a fun exercise for people. One of the things that I always like to point out is that a lot of our food, like you need that 1 gallon of water to drink per day, but that doesn't have to come from just drinking pure water. It can come from your food too. So this is part of the example here. So we have a cow. Or beef in the sense. So if you buy 1 pound of ground beef, in that is equivalent to almost 1,800 gallons of water. That's a lot of water for 1 pound of ground beef. Well, why? Well, part of it is just watering the cow, but also the feed that goes into it. So all this corn that we grow around here, well, all this corn that grows around here goes to feed animals to then feed us. And so our corn in this area is feed corn. And so, okay, all the water for that, all the water to process all the food, all the processing for the meats. There is so much water, additional water for this and this. It all adds up to 1 pound of ground beef, where beef requires 1,800 gallons of water. Tea, if you like to drink tea, just to make 1 gallon of tea requires 128 gallons of water for the processing, the water itself. So if everyone in the world drank a cup of tea in the morning, it would cost about 8 trillion gallons of water a year. That's a lot of water into it. So a lot of different products have different water uses per kilo. So coffee, I'm very sad about this because this is something I drink still. This is like my one thing. I'm like, I can't give it up. I can't give up my coffee. I've got to figure out yeah. Coffee uses a lot. So does beef, and you can see some of your different meats and stuff like that. Chicken's a lot better when it comes to water use. Cheese, rice, soybeans, wheats, barley, an apple still uses it. And when we look at other food stuff, this is in liters. So if you basically divide these numbers by 4, that tells you how many gallons are inside of it. So if you're just looking at your food, you're using a lot of water per glass of like beer here. So, a glass of beer uses 75 liters of water to grow into it. So I used to have this exercise in the class where we would go to this website. It was on the National Geographic, and I would have you go through it and try to figure out what's the worst meal you could have that uses the most amount of water. So I used to have students do that. One of the things they don't have on here are nuts. And so I mentioned about almonds and almond milk. Almonds per almond uses 1 gallon of water. That's a lot of water. So, you get that, that big box of almonds and you're just sitting there eating them because you're like, oh, this is better than me eating meat. It uses 1 gallon of water for each one of those little almonds. Also, the honeybees, the bees that need to pollinate that, the issues with that, pesticides, herbicides, how much goes into you to make the raw almond, and then to all the processing that goes in, and the sugars and the refining in order to create this almond milk is probably one of the worst things you can do for the environment. It is so water intensive, so it just Fiji water, almond milk, don't do it. But what I used to have the students do is go through and make what was the worst possible meal that they could have. And what it works out to be is beef and broccoli on rice. So if you ever go for Chinese food, beef and broccoli on rice with an almond cookie and a glass of tea is probably some of the worst thing you can do. So next time you have Chinese food and you see that beef and broccoli on rice, don't do it. Just don't do it. Okay. So I'm going to post a link here to this water calculator. It's going to be just a fun exercise for you. You can go through it and see how much water you're actually using. Are you better or not as good as average out there? And that is all.